The sun hung low over the dusty horizon, painting the plains in streaks of gold and amber, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. In a small forgotten settlement on the edge of nowhere, a man stumbled through the last remnants of what had once been his pride. His hands were calloused, his clothes tattered, and his eyes carried the weight of a life deemed useless by those who had little patience for weakness. He had been soul-traded like a worn tool, cast aside because he could not meet the harsh demands of men who measured worth by strength alone. Every scornful laugh, every derisive glance from the townsfolk had pushed him further into the shadows, until he became nothing more than a whisper of existence on the wind. The trading post smelled of old leather and smoke, the kind that clung to everything and never left. That was where they had sold him, marking him as broken before he even had a chance to prove himself. The merchants had exchanged coins with a shrug, as if the weight of a human life was equal to a few pieces of silver. The man didn't argue. He didn't have the strength left for anger. He had learned long ago that bitterness only deepened the hollows in your chest, and emptiness was already familiar enough. Yet even in the depths of rejection, there lingered a stubborn spark, one that refused to fully die. Beyond the settlement, the plains stretched endlessly, wild and unclaimed. Here, the air was different, sharp, with the scent of sagebrush and distant rivers, alive with the whispers of grasses bending in the wind. It was here that the man first glimpsed her. She moved with a quiet authority, her presence both fierce and gentle. A woman of the Apache, carrying the weight of her own grief and survival. She was alone, though not weak, for her steps spoke of battles won in silence. And her eyes, dark and piercing, held a depth of understanding that reached further than words ever could. Her body bore the promise of life anew, a child growing quietly beneath her heartbeat. And yet she seemed attuned to the pain that lingered around the stranger. Their meeting was not sudden, not the stuff of legends where fate strikes with a lightning bolt. It was softer, more deliberate. He watched from the edge of the trees, hesitant, uncertain if trust could ever find a place in his hollowed heart. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of the river and the faint temps of sweat and earth. And he realized that he had been watching her longer than he intended. There was something in her gaze, a recognition not of who he was, but of who he might become. That single moment, fleeting and fragile, planted the first seed of change. He had survived this long on scraps of kindness, mostly imagined, and the occasional mercy of strangers who didn't ask for anything in return. Yet this encounter stirred something unfamiliar possibility. She didn't speak at first, only measured him with eyes that seemed to strip away layers of shame and fear. The man found himself holding his breath, waiting for judgment, for rejection that was as inevitable as the coming night. But instead, she nodded once, a simple acknowledgement that carried more weight than 100 words of pity. That nod was an unspoken promise, a bridge between two worlds that were supposed to remain separate, two lives marked by hardship, yet drawn together by circumstance. Night descended quickly on the plains, the sky deepening into shades of indigo and violet pierced by the first glimmers of stars. The wind carried the distant howl of a lone coyote, and the man felt the old familiar ache of loneliness settle in his bones. He had known hunger, exposure, and the sting of betrayal, but never had he encountered someone who saw him without judgment, who seemed to sense the dormant strength he had long thought lost. She moved closer to the fire she had built, her hands steady as they arranged a few scattered sticks, her face illuminated in the warm glow. He wanted to speak, to thank her, but words seemed inadequate to the moment. Clumsy and heavy, the tension in the air was palpable, thick with unspoken questions. What would become of a man abandoned by his own kind, and a woman forced to navigate the perils of her world alone? Could they survive together, or was their meeting only a brief reprieve in lives shaped by struggle? The night held its breath alongside them, and for the first time in many seasons, the man felt the stirrings of hope, tentative and fragile. The stars above offered no answers, only a silent witness to the beginning of something neither had anticipated. A bond formed not from convenience but from the raw need to endure. He stepped closer, feeling the tension in his own limbs as if his body had forgotten how to move with intention. The fire crackled, casting shadows that danced across the plains, and for a moment the world beyond this small circle disappeared. The air was alive with possibility, yet heavy with the unspoken dangers that lurked in the edges of the wilderness. There were two souls standing on the threshold of change, teetering between past wounds and the promise of a new path. Every heartbeat seemed louder in the quiet, every glance laden with meaning, every breath a fragile thread tying them together. She finally spoke, her voice low but unwavering, carrying the authority of someone who had faced death and loss and chosen to keep moving. Her words were measured, deliberate, as if each one was a step on a path she had walked alone for too long. The man listened, heart pounding, the weight of his past pressing down even as the faintest glimmer of future possibilities flickered in his chest. He had been sold as useless, discarded like refuse, and yet here she was, a pregnant widow standing firm against a world that had taken everything from her. She offered no false promises, no hollow gestures. Only the stark truth that survival demanded courage. And sometimes courage was shared. The fire cast their shadows long across the plain, stretching into the unknown. Beyond the circle of light, the darkness waited, patient and indifferent, full of threats and uncertainties. The man knew that whatever path lay ahead would test him in ways he could not yet imagine. The woman's gaze met his, steady and unflinching, and in that silent exchange, a pact of sorts was made, not of convenience, not of obligation, but of recognition. Two lives fractured and scarred, poised to reshape one another in ways neither could foresee as the night deepened. The man felt the first flicker of determination rise within him. He did not yet know how he would repay the quiet trust of the Apache widow, or how he might reclaim the sense of purpose stolen from him. But in that moment, sitting across the fire from someone who understood survival and loss in equal measure, he felt the weight of being cast aside lift just enough to imagine a different life. Somewhere beyond the horizon, beyond the judgment of those who sold him as useless, lay a path untraveled, waiting to be claimed. And yet, the danger remained silent, patient, and looming as if the world itself waited to test whether this fragile hope could endure. The plains whispered secrets to the night. The fire flickered, and the man stared into the flames, wondering if he could rise to the promise hidden in her quiet strength. He did not speak. He did not need to. The air was thick with anticipation, each heartbeat marking the passage of a moment that could change everything. The story of his life, once thought concluded by cruelty and dismissal, was about to turn in ways he had never imagined. And as the shadows lengthened and the stars shone cold and distant above, both of them knew that the night held more than rest. It held the first step of a journey. Neither could yet name. The wind shifted again, carrying the faint echo of a distant threat across the plains. The man's fingers tightened around the worn edges of his coat, the firelight reflecting in eyes that had seen too much and yet yearned for more. The woman's gaze never wavered, steady and unwavering, a promise and a challenge rolled into one. Something was coming, something neither of them could yet understand. And in the uncertain silence of that night, the man realized that destiny had a new shape. A shape drawn not by those who had forsaken him, but by a pregnant Apache widow who had seen what others refused to notice. The story was far from over. The first chapter of their entwined lives had only just begun. The night pressed on, heavy with the scent of sage and distant rain. The man sat near the fire, listening to the occasional crackle of flames, each pop echoing like a tiny warning. His mind drifted, as it often did, to the past memories he had tried to bury under layers of shame and exhaustion. He remembered the first time he had been deemed useless, not by strangers, but by his own kin. A father who had measured a man's worth in muscle and endurance, a community that had no patience for hesitation or weakness. Even as a boy, he had struggled to keep up, his body slower, his hands clumsy, his voice unsure. Each failure had been recorded, remembered, and repeated until he had believed it himself. The settlement that had sold him was a little more than a scattering of wooden buildings and dusty streets, but it had been enough to shape him. He recalled the merchant's sneers, the laughter of men who measured strength in guns and horses, the way women whispered behind doors as if pity were contagious. He had tried to escape it, run across plains that shimmered in summer heat. But the weight of his own perceived uselessness followed him like a shadow. He had learned that survival demanded more than strength, demanded cunning, patience, and the ability to vanish when the world threatened to crush you. Yet even in flight, he had never truly understood freedom. It was always a precarious thing, something you glimpsed in the distance, tantalizing and unreachable. That was why seeing the Apache woman had struck him so deeply. Her presence was not a promise of comfort or safety, it was a challenge. She carried her own burdens and had survived by her own rules. She had the kind of quiet power that could change the course of someone's life if they were willing to step forward and accept it, and for reasons he could not explain. He wanted to step forward. He remembered the stories that had reached his ears during his years of wandering. Tales of Apache resilience, of women who had led their people when men had fallen, of survival against impossible odds. Some of the stories were exaggerated, embroidered by time and fear. But the kernel of truth remained. These were people who refused to yield to cruelty, injustice, or fate. And now, sitting across from one of them, he felt the weight of history pressing on his shoulders. A history that demanded respect and careful attention. He did not know her name, but her eyes told him enough. She had seen the world in ways he had never known. And in her gaze there was a quiet recognition that he too could rise, if he dared. The firelight flickered across her features as she moved to rearrange some logs. Her movements were deliberate, purposeful, a mix of strength and grace. The man noted the way her fingers brushed against the wood, how even a simple task carried meaning, how survival had taught her to make every motion count. He felt a strange admiration mixed with fear, as if acknowledging her skill might also admit his own inadequacy. Yet there was something in the way she moved, something patient and unyielding, that suggested she understood brokenness and could shape it into something useful. He wanted to ask her how she had come to be alone, how she had survived the loss of a husband, how she carried life inside her while facing the harsh realities of the world. But he remained silent, sensing that the answers would come in time, and that to demand them now would be disrespectful. Instead, he focused on observing, learning from her presence, noting how she responded to the wind, how she listened to the sounds of the night, how her eyes never left the horizon even when her attention seemed elsewhere. There was a rhythm to her awareness, a pattern shaped by hardship and necessity. He felt both intimidated and drawn to it, realizing that if he could understand even a fraction of her vigilance, he might survive the days ahead. The night deepened and the temperature dropped. He shivered despite the fire, and she glanced at him briefly, her expression unreadable. It was a small gesture, but it carried a warning. The world beyond the firelight was not forgiving. Wolves hunted silently in the distance, and men who measured life by coin and gun were never far behind. He understood suddenly that their meeting was more than coincidence. It was opportunity wrapped in danger. She had chosen this place, this moment. Perhaps sensing that his presence could serve a purpose neither of them fully understood, memories of betrayal surfaced again. Unbidden, he thought of the men who had taken advantage of his weaknesses, who had sold him without hesitation, who had laughed when he had tried to plead for dignity. Those memories were raw, a bitter tang that lingered on the tongue of his mind. But in her presence, the bitterness softened, replaced by a cautious curiosity. Perhaps he could channel that anger, that frustration, into something that mattered. Perhaps he could be more than the useless man everyone had declared him to be. She finally spoke again, her voice carrying over the fire like a steady wind. She did not ask for anything, did not offer comfort. Instead, she spoke of survival, of the harsh realities that awaited anyone who wandered unprepared in these lands. She spoke of the plains, of the rivers that could both sustain and drown, of men who would exploit weakness at the first opportunity. And then, almost casually, she mentioned the dangers that were approaching not by sight, but by intuition, by understanding the subtle signs of the world around her. The man listened, heart pounding, aware that danger might be closer than they imagined. And yet something about her certainty made him feel that they could face it. he began to share bits of his own story, cautiously revealing fragments of a past that had been heavy with shame and disappointment. He told her of the trades, the betrayals, the moments when he had believed life had nothing left for him. She listened without interruption, without judgment, her gaze steady and attentive. And in that quiet acknowledgement, he felt a small flicker of validation, as if simply being heard by someone who understood survival could ignite a spark of purpose long thought extinguished. The fire cracked again, sending a shower of sparks into the dark. Shadows leaped across the ground, dancing with a life of their own, and the man realized how fragile their safety truly was. The world beyond their small circle of light was full of hunters, full of those who would exploit weakness and disregard humanity. Yet the presence of the Apache woman offered a new lens, a way to see strength not as brute force, but as awareness, as resilience, as quiet determination. He realized that to survive, he would need to embrace more than courage. He would need to learn, adapt, and trust in ways he had never known. Hours passed, the fire reduced to glowing embers. Still, the night refused to yield its secrets. Sounds of distant movement, the crackle of dry grass, the occasional bird calling in the darkness, all hinted at life beyond their immediate perception. The man felt a growing unease, the realization that each moment of peace was temporary, that the challenges ahead were only beginning. Yet alongside the unease was a strange exhilaration. He had been cast aside as useless, yet here he was. On the edge of a possibility that could reshape everything he had known, she spoke once more, briefly about the paths that lay ahead, about the choices that could lead to survival or ruin. Her words were not comforting, but precise, shaping his understanding of the world he had only glimpsed from a distance. He realized that their encounter was no accident. She had chosen to see him, to measure him, and to offer a chance that few others would have considered. And in that choice lay both promise and parola, path forward that demanded vigilance, courage and trust. The man lay back on the earth, staring at the stars, feeling the ache of his past and the unfamiliar stirrings of hope collide in his chest. Somewhere beyond the horizon, dangers lurked, silent and patient, waiting for the slightest misstep. And yet, beside him, a presence offered guidance, strength, and an unspoken challenge. He could not yet know the full shape of the journey that awaited him, or the role the Apache widow and her unborn child would play in the life he thought had ended long ago. As the wind swept across the plains once more, carrying the faint scent of distant smoke and untamed earth, the man understood one truth. His life had been discarded, deemed worthless, but it was not over. Not yet. The night held its secrets close. The fire offered temporary warmth, and the woman beside him held a power both fierce and subtle. Their paths were now intertwined, a convergence of survival and destiny. Yet the dangers that waited beyond the firelight remained, silent and formidable. The man closed his eyes briefly, knowing that dawn would bring both opportunity and challenge, and that the first steps toward reclaiming a life thought lost would not be easy. And somewhere deep in the shadows, beyond the comfort of the fire, a distant sound, a shift in the wind. The snap of a branch reminded him that the world was never forgiving, and that every choice carried consequences. He did not yet know whether he would survive what was coming, only that the night had changed him, and that the path forward, however uncertain, had begun. The story of the man cast aside is useless. And the pregnant Apache widow who saw potential others could not, was only beginning, and the plains stretched wide and untamed, full of trials, mysteries, and the promise of transformation. The first light of dawn broke over the plains, pale and hesitant, brushing the earth with muted gold. The fire had burned down to a bed of embers, sending wisps of smoke curling into the cold morning air. The man stretched slowly, feeling muscles he had forgotten he possessed, muscles that had once been dismissed as weak or useless. Beside him, the Apache woman stirred, her hand instinctively resting on her belly, as if to shield the life growing there. The sight tugged at something deep inside him, a protective instinct he had never known existed. Mingled with the faint tremor of hope, that he had been denying himself for so long. The world around them was waking, cautious and alert. Birds called from the distant trees. Insects droned softly in the tall grass. And somewhere far off, the river murmured over rocks that had been there long before either of them. But the quiet was deceptive. Danger, invisible and patient, lingered beyond the horizon. Men who measured power in guns and cruelty had been a part of his past, and he knew instinctively that their shadows could stretch farther than he imagined. The Apache woman sensed it too. Her eyes scanned the perimeter of their small encampment with a precision that made him realize she had not been born merely to survive, but to read the land and its hidden threats with the clarity of one whose life depended on it. They began walking shortly after dawn, the man following cautiously, absorbing every lesson in silence. She moved with quiet confidence, aware of every footprint, every snapped twig under their boots. Her knowledge of the land was deep, intimate, and it reminded him painfully of all he had never known. All the ways the world had been unkind to him because he had lacked this awareness. He had always relied on endurance and hope, fragile tools against a world that demanded more. Here beside her, he realized that survival required something else: attention, patience, and the courage to act when opportunity and danger collided. The first signs of trouble appeared as the wind shifted. The scent of smoke carried faintly through the morning air, thin but unmistakable. He glanced at her, unsure if he should speak. She simply nodded, a subtle motion that told him she had already read it. Somewhere nearby, another group was moving, men whose intentions were as unpredictable as the plains themselves. Traitors, bounty hunters, or thieves the man did not know, and for now, it did not matter. The woman's decision was swift. They veered off the path, skirting a small ridge where the grass would hide their tracks, moving silently as shadows themselves. He struggled to keep pace, his lungs burning, but she waited when needed, a quiet acknowledgement that he was learning. Slowly, the rhythms of survival as they moved. She spoke of the past in fragments, stories delivered cautiously, like seeds planted for him to grow understanding. Her husband had been taken by men who sought to exploit weakness, who left death and loss in their wake. She had survived, not because she had been stronger than the rest, but because she had learned to anticipate cruelty, to see danger before it struck, and to act with deliberate calm. Her words carried weight beyond their literal meaning, teaching him lessons about trust, judgment, and the limits of reliance on others. Every sentence was a small weapon, a tool to shape his awareness, to guide him toward a survival he had never before experienced. Hours passed. The sun climbing higher, burning off the morning chill, and revealing the vast, empty stretches of land ahead. They paused near a creek, the water clear and cold, offering a brief moment of respite. The man knelt, cupping water in his hands, drinking deeply, feeling the life return to his limbs. She watched him, her gaze steady, her expression unreadable. Then, as if prompted by intuition, she scanned the distant tree line again, noticing movement that was subtle yet telling. A small group had emerged from the woods, riding quickly, intent clear in the way they advanced. The man felt a jolt of fear, the kind that could freeze a body and mind alike, but she gestured for silence. Her plan was simple, but dangerous. They would hide, they would observe, and then they would decide their next move. The riders drew closer, and he could see their ragged clothing, the gleam of weapons catching the sun. They were men of the frontier, hardened and unyielding, who measured value in coin and intimidation. He recognized that look the same as the merchants who had sold him, the same as every man who had decided he was useless. The fear was familiar, but now it mingled with something else: resolve. She had chosen him for a reason, and whatever came next, he would not be left behind. Not now. The group passed the creek without noticing them, the tall grass hiding their presence effectively. The man exhaled slowly, relief mingling with tension, but the woman's eyes were already scanning the horizon again. Danger had passed for now, but the sense of being hunted remained. He realized that their journey would be measured not just by distance or time, but by their ability to navigate constant threat, to adapt to every subtle shift in the land and the people who sought to exploit it. The afternoon heat pressed down, and they made a shallow camp beneath a lone tree. Here, the woman finally allowed a moment of rest, preparing a small meal of dried meat and roots, teaching him the method she had used to sustain herself. Each lesson was more than survival, it was transformation. The man began to feel his body responding, muscles remembered, instincts sharpening. It was difficult and sometimes painful. But he recognized that the old version of himself, useless and discarded, was being stripped away. The fire of purpose, small but growing, began to burn. As they ate, she spoke of others, of tribes and settlements, of the networks of survival and trust that existed in the harsh expanse. She spoke cautiously, knowing that information was both weapon and shield. Through her words, he learned that the world was not simply cruel, it was complex, layered with alliances, betrayals, and rules that could mean life or death. Every lesson deepened his awareness, shaping his understanding of danger and opportunity, of loyalty and betrayal, of the fragile nature of trust. Even as they rested, attention remained, a subtle reminder that the world beyond the tree was not idle. Small signs, too minor for most to notice, hinted at movement. Footprints half buried in sand, a bent twig pointing toward the ridge, a distant sound that might have been wind or might not. The man realized that the plains were alive, that survival was not simply about strength, but about reading the quiet signals, about acting with precision before chaos struck. He felt the old fear rise, but alongside it, an unfamiliar confidence. He was learning to see, to anticipate, to prepare not just for himself, but for the woman and the life she carried. As evening approached, they moved again, traveling toward higher ground where the view could extend for miles. The Apache woman's pace remained steady, controlled, as if she were aware of every element of the terrain, every sound that might hint at danger. The man followed, his body sore but alert, his mind sharpened by necessity. Shadows stretched long across the plains, painting the land in shifting patterns that concealed threats and offered fleeting safety. He began to understand the rhythm of movement, the balance between patience and action, the way small decisions could change the outcome of encounters with those who would harm them. Suddenly, a voice called out from the ridge above, sharp and commanding. The man froze, heart hammering as he realized they had been spotted. The woman's hand went to his shoulder, steadying him, and then she raised a hand toward the intruders. She did not speak. She did not hesitate. The moment stretched, a tense standoff where every second seemed to expand into eternity. The riders above scanned the plain, unaware of the ground-level detail that might determine their success or failure. The man could feel the pulse of fear in his own veins, but alongside it ran a current of determination he had not known he possessed. The woman finally moved, signaling for them to descend into a shallow ravine hidden from view. They slipped silently down, the man following her every step, learning to trust her instincts even when his own mind screamed caution. The riders passed above, unaware of the pair's position, their shouts fading as they moved on. Relief surged, but the man knew it was temporary. The plains had offered safety this time, but danger would return, persistent and patient, testing every skill, every instinct they had, as night fell again. The man realized that survival was no longer simply about escaping past failures. It was about mastering the land, mastering fear, and mastering trust in someone who had chosen to see value in him when the world had not. He did not yet know the outcome, or whether the dangers to come could be overcome. But he felt the stirrings of purpose, a reason to endure, a spark of life beyond the uselessness he had once accepted. And somewhere beyond the darkness, beyond the reach of firelight, the plains whispered of threats, of men who would exploit weakness, of trials yet to come. The woman's gaze met his, steady and unwavering, and he understood that the journey ahead would test everything he thought he knew about himself, about loyalty, and about survival. The night stretched before them, long and uncertain, full of danger and possibility, and the first steps toward their intertwined destiny had begun. But the true challenges were yet to come. The wind carried faint echoes of distant riders, reminders that the world beyond their small circle of firelight was never still, never safe, and that each choice, each movement, could shift the balance between life and death. The man felt the weight of what lay ahead, but alongside it, a fragile confidence that together, perhaps they could navigate the perils that waited. The story of the man deemed useless, and the pregnant Apache widow who had chosen to see potential in him was far from over. The plains were wide, the dangers real, and the path forward uncertain, but for the first time, he sensed that survival might be possible. Even if the cost remained unknown, the wind had shifted again by the time they reached the ridge overlooking the valley below, carrying with it a sharp scent of dust, smoke, and something unfamiliar danger wrapped in the subtle perfume of human intent. The man squinted against the sinking sun, muscles taut from hours of walking and constant vigilance. Every instinct screamed that they were being watched, that eyes hidden somewhere beyond the distant trees had already marked them. He stole a glance at the Apache woman, noting the calm precision in her posture, the way she surveyed the terrain as if she had lived every inch of it before. Her hand rested lightly on the bow strapped to her back, fingers brushing the carved wood like a natural extension of her own strength. Below, the valley spread wide and open, broken only by a meandering river that reflected the dying light. The man knew that moving through it without detection would be impossible. He felt the familiar twinge of fear, that same sense that had gripped him the day he had been sold, the day the world had deemed him useless. But the presence of the woman beside him shifted something in his chest. Fear was tempered by focus, by a cautious understanding that survival was now a shared effort. Every step they took, every pause, every glance into the shadowed edges of the valley was measured, deliberate. The first sign of trouble came as movement in the trees, a subtle ripple in the undergrowth that might have gone unnoticed if he had not been attuned to the woman's instincts. He froze, heart pounding, as figures emerged, roughed men on horseback, their eyes sharp and calculating, weapons glinting in the last light of day. They were not simply hunters. They carried the air of men who had hunted before, men who knew the value of fear. The man instinctively ducked behind the ridge, trying to make himself as small as possible, and the woman mirrored his action, silent and graceful, her body coiled with readiness. He realized suddenly that these were the same types of men who had shaped his life of rejection, who had judged strength as the only measure of worth. They had names he would never know, motives he could only guess. But one thing was certain: they were danger incarnate, and escape would require more than luck. The woman whispered softly, words clipped and deliberate, mapping their movements, analyzing their intent, offering silent instruction without drawing attention. He followed, absorbing each nuance, realizing that every mistake here could cost more than money, or pride could cost life. Hours passed in tense stillness. The sun dipped below the horizon, leaving the valley bathed in shadow. The men on horseback circled below, cautious, methodical, unaware that the pair above had already anticipated their every move. The man's muscles ached, his lungs burned, but he could not afford distraction. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a branch sent his pulse racing. He watched the woman, learning not just her skill, but her patience. She moved silently, a predator of circumstance, knowing when to strike and when to wait. As darkness settled, the first confrontation became inevitable. One of the riders had strayed from the main group, moving too close to the ridge. The man felt a cold rush of adrenaline as the woman signaled him to stay low, her eyes locked on the intruder. Time seemed to stretch, the night itself holding its breath. The rider's silhouette cut against the pale moonlight, unaware that they were moments from discovery. The woman's hand moved subtly, and the man realized he had been holding his own breath for too long. The tension was unbearable, yet they remained motionless, shadows themselves against the earth. Suddenly the rider stopped, turning toward the ridge with suspicion. The man felt panic rise, his instincts screaming for movement, for escape, for something anything but the woman's steady presence anchored him. She signaled again, a subtle shift that told him to trust her. And the rider moved on, unaware of how close disaster had come. The man exhaled slowly, relief mingled with a creeping dread. The valley was full of hunters. And this encounter was only the first of many. Night deepened, bringing with it both cover and uncertainty. They moved again, descending the ridge carefully, every step calculated to avoid detection. The man felt a growing sense of responsibility, not just for himself, but for the woman and the life she carried. He had never protected anyone in his life. Survival had always been a solitary pursuit. But now, the stakes were higher, and the weight of that responsibility pressed down on him in a way that was both terrifying and empowering. The creek they reached provided water, but also a reflection of the constant danger. Across its banks, shadows shifted unnaturally, hinting at more than the natural night sounds. The man's heart quickened as he realized they were being followed, and the woman's hand rested lightly on his shoulder, guiding him silently into the brush. They waited hidden, listening to the soft rustle of leaves and the distant snap of a twig. The presence of danger was palpable, almost alive. Moving closer with every breath, hours passed with no sound from the hunters, and the man began to think they might have eluded them, until a faint whistle pierced the night. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but he recognized the signal instinctively. The hunters were communicating, coordinating, and their numbers might be larger than anticipated. The woman's expression hardened, and he knew she had already formulated a plan, though she shared nothing aloud. He could only follow, silent and obedient. Trusting instincts he was only beginning to understand. They traveled toward higher ground once more, aiming for a narrow ridge that overlooked both the valley and the river beyond. The man felt the tension coiling in his stomach, a knot of fear and anticipation. Every sound, every shadow, every distant rustle held meaning. He realized he had never truly understood suspense until this moment, the constant, grinding uncertainty of being hunted, the need to anticipate the next move before it came. The razor edge between survival and death, at last. They reached the top, pausing to survey the land. Below, the valley seemed calm, but he knew better. The shadows of men, moving with quiet purpose, lurked just out of sight. He looked to the woman, her eyes scanning the horizon, calculating, always calculating. He felt a surge of respect, tinged with awe. She was not simply surviving. She was shaping the outcome, orchestrating the smallest movements with precision. He felt both inspired and overwhelmed, knowing that he had much to learn if they were to survive what was coming. The first direct confrontation arrived soon after. A rider broke from the line, moving quickly toward their ridge, intent clear in the way he handled his weapon. The man's pulse surged, and he could feel fear gnawing at his resolve. The woman leaned close, whispering instructions, guiding him through the movement, teaching him instinctively how to act. They slipped into the cover of rocks and brush, heartbeats loud in the silence. Every muscle in his body screamed with the tension of the moment. Every breath measured against the possibility of discovery. The rider passed, narrowly missing their position, and the man exhaled with a mixture of relief and dread. He realized that this was only the beginning. The hunters were relentless, patient, and ruthless. Every choice, every step, could tip the balance between survival and disaster. And yet, beside him, the woman remained a constant, steady in purpose, unflinching even as danger crept closer. Her calmness was infectious, yet he understood that they were on a knife's edge, and one mistake could bring everything crashing down. They descended into the valley under cover of darkness, moving slowly toward a hidden path the woman had identified. Every sound, every shadow, every crackling branch carried meaning, teaching him lessons about perception, patience, and instinct. He began to understand that survival was not simply about strength or endurance. It was about awareness, about reading the signs others missed, about trusting instincts he had long ignored. As they moved, distant voices echoed from the valley floor, rough and deliberate. The hunters were coordinating, strategizing, seeking the pair with a methodical persistence. The man's chest tightened with every passing moment, the suspense building to an almost unbearable degree. He realized that the coming hours would test everything he had learned, everything he had survived, and everything he was capable of becoming. The woman's presence was his anchor, yet he could feel the tension radiating from her. A subtle reminder that even the strongest could be pushed to breaking by the time they reached a dense thicket that promised temporary cover. The man's muscles were screaming, his mind racing, and his senses sharpened to a painful degree. They paused, listening to the valley below, hearing the faintest whispers of movement, the careful tread of boots on dry earth, the distant jingle of horse gear. Danger was closing, patient and inevitable, and the man understood that there would be no simple escape. The next moments would demand courage, cunning, and complete reliance on instincts he had only begun to trust. The woman crouched beside him, her eyes scanning the darkness, her hand brushing against his in a silent signal of readiness. He felt the tension coil in his stomach, a mixture of fear and anticipation so sharp it almost hurt. Every instinct told him that the hunters were near, that confrontation was unavoidable, and that survival would depend on more than luck. He realized that he had been tested before, but never like this, never with so much at stake. Never with the life of another depending on his actions. Never with destiny poised to shift in an instant. The wind shifted again, carrying a faint, unmistakable sound, a horse's hoof striking rock, a low murmur of conversation, the careful whisper of a plan taking shape. The hunters were closing, and the man could feel the suspense crawling across his skin, wrapping every nerve in tension. The woman's eyes met his, steady and unflinching, and in that look, he understood the truth. The climax of their ordeal was about to arrive, and the choices they made in the next moments could change everything. The night was alive with danger. The valley below, heavy with unseen threats, and the ridge above, silent but tense with anticipation. The man realized that his past of being deemed useless had brought him here, to this precise moment, and that every failure, every dismissal, every betrayal had been leading to this trial. Beside him, the woman readied herself, and he followed suit, heart hammering, senses alight, aware that the final confrontation was imminent. Beyond the thicket, beyond the shadowed valley, the hunters moved closer, unaware that the pair they sought were not only prepared, but watching, learning, and ready to act. Every second stretched, every sound amplified, every shadow a potential threat. The man understood that the story of his life, once thought concluded by rejection and failure, was about to collide with destiny, with danger, and with the will of a woman who had seen potential when the world had not. And as the moon cast a cold, silver light across the valley, as the wind whispered threats and promises alike, the man knew that the moment of reckoning was almost here. Every lesson, every choice, every heartbeat had led to this edge. And the plains themselves seemed to hold their breath, waiting for the first move that would decide what came next. The suspense was unbearable, the tension sharp, and the world beyond the ridge seemed alive with expectation. They were poised on the cusp of the climax, the final hours before fate would test them both, and the next step could change everything. Ridge shivered under the cool moonlight as the first sounds of confrontation reached them. The hunters had discovered the edge of their hiding spot, voices sharp and commanding, horses snorting in impatience. The man's chest tightened, his heart hammering. But the fear that had gripped him for years, the fear of being useless, of being discarded, had shifted into something else. Determination. Survival. The spark the Apache woman had seen in him so long ago was finally blazing bright. She moved first, silent and precise, a shadow among shadows. The man followed, remembering every lesson she had taught him, how to move without sound, how to anticipate the enemy's next step, how to use the terrain to your advantage. He realized that every misstep in his past had been preparation for this moment. Every failure had taught him patience. Every time he had been underestimated had taught him awareness. Now, those lessons would be tested, and he was ready. The hunters were cautious, scanning the ridge, unaware of how close their targets had been all along. The woman had chosen the perfect place, the high ground giving them vision and leverage. She signaled to him, a subtle shift of her hand. And he knew they would act together, each instinct guided by trust and shared survival. He felt a surge of respect for her. This was not only courage, but strategy. leadership forged by loss and necessity. Suddenly, a rider spotted movement below, and the tense silence erupted into chaos. Horses bolted, weapons raised, and the hunters realized too late that they were not the hunters. They were being cornered by two who had learned patience and precision. The man moved with deliberate speed, catching a weapon that had fallen from a horse, using it to block a charge, protect the woman. His hands were steady now, no longer trembling from doubt or fear. The lessons of survival, once theoretical, had become instinct. The Apache woman was relentless, striking with precision, forcing the hunters to retreat or risk exposure. She moved fluidly, every motion economical, shaped by experience and urgency. The man mirrored her actions, combining the knowledge she had imparted with a courage that had been dormant too long. Together, they became a force that the hunters could neither predict nor anticipate. Each second was critical, each heartbeat a measure of life and death as the confrontation escalated. The man realized how far he had come. The one who had been sold as useless was now vital, not only to his own survival, but to hers and the life she carried within her. It was a revelation that stirred something deep in him, a sense of purpose he had never known. He was no longer a shadow of failure. He was a participant in his own destiny, a partner in shaping the outcomes of forces far larger than himself, the hunters. Sensing the tide turning, attempted a final push, hoping to overwhelm them with numbers and brute force. But the terrain, their preparation, and the woman's strategy turned the tables. The man and the Apache woman moved like extensions of one another, their actions synchronized by trust and understanding. The hunters found themselves disoriented, forced into retreat, the moonlight casting their failure in long, dark shadows across the valley. When the last of the pursuers had disappeared into the night, silence fell over the ridge. The man sank to the ground, exhausted, every muscle aching, but alive. The woman rested beside him, her breathing heavy but steady, her eyes reflecting the pale glow of the moon. They did not speak at first. Words were unnecessary. The danger had passed, and with it the suffocating tension of anticipation. The man realized that in surviving this night, he had proven to himself what the world had once denied him, that his life had value, that he could protect, act, and endure. Morning arrived slowly, painting the plains in gentle hues of gold and lavender. The creek below whispered softly as water flowed over rocks, and the man allowed himself the first true breath of relief he had felt in years. The woman moved with her usual grace, tending to minor injuries, checking the surroundings, and finally, for the first time, smiling faintly. It was not a grand gesture, but it was enough a signal that the trials they had faced had not broken them, that trust and resilience could carry them beyond fear as they walked toward a safer part of the valley. The woman spoke of the future in tentative terms. The man listened, understanding that survival was no longer just about evasion. It was about building, planning, and preparing for the days to come. The land could be harsh, unyielding, but it was also a place of opportunity, a place where careful strategy, courage, and cooperation could shape outcomes. The man realized he had a role to play, that his past uselessness was irrelevant now. He had been tested, trained, and transformed. Along the way, they encountered remnants of other travelers, signs of both danger and kindness. A small settlement, wary but not hostile, offered supplies and guidance. The man marveled at the interactions, realizing that the world was not simply cruel, it was layered, complex, and full of people whose choices mattered as much as the forces of nature. The woman navigated these encounters with skill, showing him that leadership was not only action in crisis, but judgment in calm. He began to understand her world, seeing patterns in behavior. Recognizing the balance between trust and caution, days passed and the man's confidence grew. He learned to read tracks, anticipate threats, and make choices that kept both himself and the woman safe. Every lesson she offered was a tool. Every experience a reminder that value was measured not by past failure, but by current action. He began to feel a sense of belonging for the first time, a fragile but growing recognition that he mattered. that his life had direction. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, they paused on a hill overlooking a wide expanse of plains and forest. The woman's hand rested lightly on her belly, and the man realized the weight of their shared journey, not just survival, but protection, trust, and the possibility of life beyond fear. He felt a profound respect for her, for the strength that had carried her through loss, and for the courage that allowed her to see potential in someone who had been discarded. They set up camp for the night, the fire crackling with warmth and quiet celebration. The man reflected on the lessons of the past, the betrayal, the dismissal, the endless struggles, and realized that every hardship had prepared him for this moment. The world had sold him as useless, but he had endured, learned, and grown. Now, beside the woman who had chosen to trust him, he felt capable of more than survival. He felt capable of life, of partnership, and of hope as the stars emerged. Bright and patient above, he and the woman spoke quietly, sharing fragments of stories, fears, and dreams. The night was full of reflection, each word strengthening the bond between them, each silence carrying mutual understanding. They did not need grand gestures or declarations. Their trust and shared experience had already woven a connection stronger than most words could convey. The journey ahead remained uncertain. The plains could still hold danger, the hunters might return, and challenges yet unseen waited over the horizon. But the man no longer felt helpless, no longer believed in the uselessness the world had imposed upon him. He had discovered skill, courage, and purpose through trial and guidance. He had learned to trust himself, to act decisively, and to stand alongside someone who saw beyond surface flaws to the potential within. By the first light of dawn, they were moving again, traveling with purpose and careful awareness. The man noticed how much he had changed, how his posture was more assured, how his gaze had sharpened, how his movements carried intention. He was no longer a passive figure in a world that had once discarded him. He was active, capable, and essential. He had learned that value was not given, it was earned on now. He was finally earning his place, not just in the world, but beside someone who had seen him at his lowest and chosen to believe in him. They crossed a small stream, the water cool against their boots, and the man felt a quiet sense of triumph. Not over others, not in victory against enemies, but over the life that had been stolen from him by doubt and dismissal. He had reclaimed agency, skill, and trust. The woman glanced at him, a faint smile touching her lips, and he understood that the journey was no longer just survival. It was building, shaping, and moving forward together. By midday, they reached the edge of a larger settlement, one that promised resources and community. The man approached with measured steps, no longer shrinking from the world, no longer defined by past rejection. The woman moved beside him, proud and watchful, and together, they entered the settlement not as fugitives, but as people who had survived, grown, and forged a partnership born of necessity, trust, and courage. The townsfolk regarded them with curiosity, but the man no longer feared judgment. He had proven, to himself and to life itself, that he was not useless. Every glance from the woman, every subtle nod, reinforced the truth he had discovered across plains, ridges, and valleys. Strength was measured not by muscle alone, but by perseverance, awareness, and the courage to face fear when the world said you were worthless. As night fell for the final time on this chapter of their journey, the man and the woman settled near a fire once more, the unborn child moving gently beneath her hand. The man's eyes met hers, gratitude and understanding passing silently between them. They had faced danger, survived trials, and discovered trust and purpose. The plains still whispered of challenges, of life and death beyond the horizon, but for the first time, the man felt ready to meet them not as someone discarded, but as someone forged through hardship, guided by courage, and defined by potential finally realized. And so, as stars shimmered above and the firelight danced across the valley, the man who had once been sold as useless understood a truth deeper than any lesson. Any hardship or any battle, life could be reclaimed. Purpose could be found, And destiny could be reshaped when someone had the courage to see the potential hidden within. The Apache widow had not only changed his fate, she had shown him the strength he had carried all along, waiting only for the chance to be recognized, trusted, and embraced. The plains were still vast, still untamed, still holding countless mysteries and dangers, but now the man faced them with skill, awareness, and heart. The story of rejection and survival had reached its resolution. Not through the mercy of others, but through endurance, courage, and the transformative power of trust. And as he sat by the fire, watching the night stretch beyond the horizon, he understood that no matter what lay ahead, he would never again be defined as useless. And that realization alone was freedom. Top of form, bottom of form.